He had fired 6 translators in 3 weeks. Each one had left his mansion either sobbing into their hands or shaking so violently they could barely sign the non-disclosure agreements shoved into their trembling fingers. The Bratva boss slammed his fist against the mahogany table hard enough to rattle the crystal decanters and cursed in brutal guttural Russian, absolutely certain no one else in that suffocating room could understand a single syllable of what he was saying. Then the plus-size maid, quietly refilling his vodka glass, answered him back in flawless, aristocratic St. Petersburg Russian, and casually quoted Dostoevsky while doing it. The entire room stopped breathing, because in that single frozen moment, she had just revealed she had understood every criminal secret whispered inside that mansion for the past 14 months. And Viktor Volkov, the most feared Bratva boss on the entire East Coast, did not know whether to have her killed by sunrise or make her the most dangerous woman in his empire. The Volkov estate stretched across 42 acres of Long Island's Gold Coast, a Gothic mansion of dark stone and iron gates that overlooked the cold, restless waters of the Atlantic. The air inside the mansion always smelled of imported black tea, gun oil, and old money. Persian rugs, older than most countries, covered the marble floors. Hand-carved Russian icons watched from every corner. In the wine cellar sat 40-year-old bottles of beluga vodka, lined up beside 1982 Chateau Lafite that had never been opened. The chandeliers were Austrian crystal. The silverware was hand-forged in Tula. Everything inside those walls whispered the same message to any visitor foolish enough to enter. This is a house built on violence, patience, and the kind of wealth that outlives kings. Anya Petrov was 29 years old, 5 feet 6 inches tall, and 235 pounds of quiet, invisible dignity. She had soft chestnut hair pulled into a low, tidy bun at the nape of her neck, warm hazel eyes that had seen too much grief for someone still so young, and she wore a plain gray maid's uniform that stretched slightly across her broad shoulders every time she reached for something on a high shelf. She had worked inside the Volkov estate for exactly 14 months. In all of that time, Viktor Volkov had never spoken a single word directly to her. He had passed her in hallways. He had eaten meals she had served. He had walked past her while she scrubbed the marble stairs on her knees at 4 in the morning. And not once had his ice-blue eyes ever truly landed on her face. To Anya, that was a mercy, because Anya Petrov was hiding something so dangerous, so completely unimaginable, that if the Volkov Bratva ever discovered it, she would not survive to see the next sunrise. She spoke perfect Russian, not the clumsy textbook Russian of college students, not the broken tourist Russian of hopeful immigrants. She spoke the elegant, cultured Russian of the St. Petersburg aristocracy, because her late father, Dr. Mikhail Petrov, had been a professor of Slavic literature at Columbia University, and her late mother had been a Bolshoi-trained ballerina who had defected to the United States in the 1980s. Anya had grown up reading Pushkin before English children's books. She had spent every summer until the age of 16 in her grandmother's apartment in St. Petersburg, wandering the halls of the Hermitage, and learning to translate the criminal slang of the underworld from novels her father secretly disapproved of. Russian was not a language to her. Russian was the sound of her father's voice reading her to sleep. Russian was the language she still dreamed in. But when both of her parents died within 18 months of each other, her mother from a sudden stroke, her father from pancreatic cancer that ate through him at Memorial Sloan Kettering in less than a year, Anya had been left with $95,000 in student loans from her master's degree in comparative literature and another $60,000 in unpaid medical bills. She had applied for every academic position, every publishing job, every translation contract she could find. But the world had looked at her plus-size body, her grief-hollowed eyes, and her lack of connections, and the world had said no. So when a domestic staffing agency offered her a live-in maid position at a private estate on Long Island, housing included, no experience required, discretion mandatory, Anya had lied on the application. She had said she spoke only English. She had said she had no family. She had said she had no education beyond high school. She had made herself small, invisible, and grateful. And she had walked into the Volkov mansion swearing to herself that she would never let anyone in that house learn what she truly was. Her manager was Miss Delacroix, a rail-thin Frenchwoman in her 50s with cold gray eyes and a mouth that had never once curved into a genuine smile. Delacroix ran the household staff of 38 people with the ruthless precision of a woman who had spent her entire life in service to the very rich, and who despised anyone who reminded her of the softness she had trained out of herself. She hated Anya on sight. She hated the way Anya's uniform strained across her hips. She hated the way the younger staff members quietly gravitated toward Anya for kindness. She hated that Anya never cried, never complained, never gave her the satisfaction of a broken response. One morning in the servants' corridor, Delacroix cornered Anya near the linen closet and hissed loud enough for 2 passing housemaids to hear. "Tuck in that uniform, Anya. You are a walking embarrassment to this house. Mr. Volkov does not pay us to look like sacks of potatoes waddling around his marble floors. If it were up to me, you would have been dismissed the day you arrived." Anya bit the inside of her cheek until she tasted the sharp copper of her own blood. She lowered her eyes. She said only, "Yes, Miss Delacroix," and she continued folding the linens as if nothing had happened. But Anya was not invisible in the ways Delacroix believed, because Anya heard everything. She heard the lieutenants planning shipments through Newark in her 2nd week. She heard Viktor order the execution of a rival captain in her 4th month. She heard the accountants discussing offshore transfers to Cyprus in the 7th month. She heard a bodyguard confess to his brother that he was skimming from the boss and would be dead within the year if he didn't disappear. She heard the boss's cousin threaten a diplomat's wife. She heard, and she heard, and she heard, and she said nothing. She wrote nothing down. She never met the eyes of the men who spoke these secrets in front of her, because she understood something they did not. In a house full of dangerous men, the only person more dangerous than the one holding the gun was the one holding the information. Viktor Volkov was 36 years old, 6 feet 3 inches of lean, controlled violence, and the most feared Bratva boss operating anywhere between Miami and Vladivostok. He had jet black hair going silver at the temples, ice blue eyes that had watched men die without ever changing color, and a faded scar cutting through his left eyebrow that he had received at 19 when he had killed the 3 men who had murdered his younger brother. He wore bespoke Brioni suits in charcoal and navy. An orthodox gold cross rested against his chest beneath every crisp white shirt, and he smelled always of sandalwood, black tea, and the faint metallic ghost of gunpowder. He was brilliant. He was ruthless. He was patient enough to wait 10 years to destroy an enemy. And in the past 3 weeks, he had been driven to the edge of his considerable temper by a single problem he could not solve. He needed a translator, and every single translator he had hired had failed him catastrophically. The first translator had been discovered feeding information to an undercover FBI agent. That one had been handled in a shipping container in Red Hook. The second had softened Viktor's threats during a negotiation with the Georgian syndicate, nearly costing him a $200 million shipping route through the Black Sea. The third could not understand the criminal dialect of the Moscow underworld, the coded thieves' cant that his rivals used specifically to hide their true intentions in plain sight. The fourth had broken into hysterical sobbing during an interrogation Viktor had allowed her to witness, and she had been paid a great deal of money to forget everything she had seen and to leave the country permanently. The fifth had been caught taking bribes from the Kuznetsov brothers, the same Moscow family Viktor was preparing to negotiate a $340 million arms deal with in less than 48 hours. That one had simply disappeared. The sixth had lasted a single afternoon before quitting in tears without ever explaining why. And now Viktor Volkov had 48 hours until the most important negotiation of his career, and he had no one he could trust to sit at his right hand and translate the venom the Kuznetsov brothers would inevitably try to hide behind polite Russian smiles. If you're already hooked on Anya's story, do me one small favor, smash that like button right now, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. It genuinely helps these stories reach more people who need to hear them. That was the state of Viktor Volkov's mood on the gray, freezing Thursday afternoon when Anya Petrov walked into his mahogany-paneled study, carrying a silver tray of chilled beluga vodka and traditional zakouski, pickled herring on black rye, blini topped with sturgeon caviar, thin slices of smoked salmon arranged around a small mountain of horseradish cream. 3 of Viktor's most trusted lieutenants were already seated in leather chairs around the massive desk. Dmitri, the eldest, a bald mountain of a man with knuckles like walnuts. Sergei, the strategist, with wire-framed glasses and a lawyer's calm cruelty. And Yuri, the enforcer, young and restless and dangerous, with prison tattoos climbing up the sides of his neck. All 3 men had been drinking for nearly an hour, and all 3 had been arguing quietly in Russian about which of them should have to tell Viktor that a 7th translator, hastily arranged that morning, had refused the job the moment she learned the Volkov name. Anya had heard every word of that argument from the hallway. She had heard Yuri suggest they simply kidnap a linguistics professor from NYU and force her to translate at gunpoint. She had heard Sergei calmly reply that Viktor would have Yuri's tongue cut out for suggesting something so stupid, so close to a major deal. And she had heard Dmitri sigh heavily and say, in the resigned voice of a man who had known Viktor since childhood, that the boss was about to lose his temper in a way none of them had seen in years. Anya set the tray down on the sideboard with the practiced, silent movements of a woman who had spent 14 months making herself invisible in dangerous rooms. She began arranging the small crystal glasses. She poured the vodka with a steady hand, 3 fingers exactly for each man, the way Russian tradition demanded. She placed a linen napkin beside each glass. She had almost finished, was reaching across the desk to set down the final glass in front of Viktor himself, when the edge of her silver tray grazed a leather folder resting on the polished mahogany. It was the smallest possible contact, a whisper of metal against leather. But a single trembling drop of ice-cold vodka slipped from the rim of the glass and landed directly on the top page of Viktor's private correspondence. The room went dangerously quiet. Viktor Volkov looked down at the drop of vodka darkening the paper. Then he looked slowly, deliberately, up at Anya. For the first time in 14 months, his ice-blue eyes truly landed on her face. He saw her plain gray uniform. He saw the way the fabric stretched across her shoulders. He saw her lowered gaze, her folded hands, her instinctive small step backward. And Viktor Volkov, exhausted from 3 weeks of failed translators, humiliated by the impossibility of tomorrow's negotiation, furious at every single thing that had gone wrong in his empire that week, snapped. He did not raise his voice. He never raised his voice. But he spoke in rapid, brutal, contemptuous Russian, absolutely certain that the plus-size maid standing frozen before him could not understand a single syllable. He said, his voice low and cold and cutting, "Watch where you're going, cow. You weigh more than you're worth. Get out of my sight before I have you thrown into the street with the rest of the garbage." Dmitri barked out a short, guttural laugh. Yuri smirked and reached for his vodka. Sergei simply shook his head, amused by his boss's rare display of open cruelty. All 3 men knew exactly what their boss had said, and all 3 men were absolutely certain the fat little maid standing in front of them had understood nothing at all. Anya Petrov froze. The silver tray in her hands suddenly weighed 1,000 pounds. 14 months. 14 months of biting the inside of her cheek. 14 months of Miss Delacroix's daily poison. 14 months of scrubbing floors on her knees at 4 in the morning, while men in that very study planned murders in the language of her dead father. 14 months of grief and silence, and shrinking herself so small she could barely feel her own heartbeat. And now this man, this cold, beautiful, dangerous man who had never once looked at her, had just called her a cow. In her father's language, in her mother's language, in the language she had learned to read before she had learned to read English. Something inside Anya Petrov, something that had been quietly cracking for years, finally broke clean through. She set the tray down on the sideboard with careful, deliberate hands. She turned back to face Viktor Volkov. She lifted her chin, and when she spoke in flawless, aristocratic St. Petersburg Russian, the kind of Russian that Viktor's own grandmother had spoken, the kind of Russian that belonged to prima ballerinas and university professors and the vanished world of pre-revolutionary literary salons. She said quietly, her voice perfectly steady, "Forgive me, Mr. Volkov. Next time I will move more carefully as you choose your words when you think no one understands you." Dmitri dropped his cigar into his lap. Yuri's vodka glass slipped from his fingers and shattered against the leg of his chair, sending pale liquid and crystal shards across the Persian rug. Sergei's jaw fell open, his lawyer's mind visibly cycling through 14 months of every dangerous conversation this maid had almost certainly overheard. And Viktor Volkov, the man who had watched enemies die without blinking, the man who had ordered assassinations while eating breakfast, the man who had not been genuinely surprised by another human being in over a decade. Viktor Volkov stopped breathing. But Anya was not finished, because the anger that had cracked open inside her chest was not the loud, screaming kind of anger. It was the quiet, cold, precise kind of anger that Russian literature had spent 2 centuries perfecting. She tilted her head slightly, held Viktor's ice-blue stare without flinching, and offered him one last, perfectly aimed strike. In softer Russian, in the almost gentle voice of a woman reciting a favorite line, she quoted Dostoevsky. She said, "The soul is healed by being with children." Then she paused and added quietly in her own words, "But yours, Mr. Volkov, I think was broken long before you ever learned how to hurt others." The silence that followed was not silence. It was a vacuum. It was the airless, gravity-crushed quiet of a room that had just watched a plus-size maid in a gray uniform put a knife straight through the chest of the most feared Bratva boss on the East Coast, without ever raising her voice above a whisper. Dmitri had gone the color of wet ash. Yuri's hand had drifted with instinctive, professional slowness toward the shoulder holster beneath his jacket, and he was staring at Anya with the wide, uncomprehending eyes of a man who had just realized he might have discussed 3 murders directly in front of this woman over the past year. Sergei was doing the math faster than any of them, calculating exactly how much information had been spoken in Russian inside these walls, exactly how much of it this maid had heard, and exactly how catastrophic her existence had just become to the entire Volkov organization. Viktor Volkov did not move. He did not blink. He simply stared at Anya Petrov as if he had never seen her before, because in every way that mattered, he never had. His ice-blue eyes traveled slowly across her face, taking in her steady chin, her unafraid mouth, the faint copper taste of her bitten cheek that she could not hide behind her lips. He took in the perfect aristocratic inflection of her Russian, the specific literary cadence of her Dostoevsky, the trembling but unbroken dignity of a woman who had just quite possibly signed her own death warrant in exchange for one moment of being seen. And slowly, so slowly that no one else in the room dared to breathe, Viktor Volkov leaned back in his enormous leather chair. The leather creaked loudly in the crushed silence. He steepled his long fingers beneath his chin, and he began very softly to smile. It was not a mocking smile. It was not the amused smile of a boss enjoying a subordinate's humiliation. It was something far more dangerous, the intrigued, hyper-focused, absolutely captivated smile of a predator who had just realized that the small, quiet creature he had dismissed for 14 months was, in fact, the most interesting thing in his entire empire. Viktor lifted one gloved hand and made a single, silent gesture toward the door. His 3 lieutenants, Dmitri, Sergei, and Yuri, rose immediately, without a word, and filed out of the study with the disciplined speed of men who understood that whatever was about to happen in this room was not for them to witness. The heavy oak door closed behind them with a soft, final click. Before we go further into what Viktor asks her next, because trust me, his next question changes everything, do me a favor and hit subscribe if you haven't already. This is the kind of story that only gets darker, deeper, and more dangerous from here. Viktor Volkov and Anya Petrov were now completely alone. And for the first time in 14 months, she was not invisible. She was the only thing in the room he could see. He studied her for a long, unhurried moment, his ice-blue eyes cataloging every detail he had missed. The dancer's straight spine she had inherited from her mother. The scholar's careful vocabulary she had inherited from her father. The calm, unbroken breathing of a woman who had grown up in a house where men in dark suits sometimes came to visit her father in the middle of the night and left before dawn without ever giving their names. When he finally spoke, his voice was different than it had been 30 seconds earlier. It was quieter. It was almost gentle. And it was still, unmistakably, in Russian. He asked softly, "How long have you understood every word spoken in this house?" Anya swallowed once. Her heart was hammering against her ribs, so hard she was certain he could hear it from across the desk. But her voice, when it came, was steady. She answered, 14 months, Mr. Volkov. Since the day I arrived." Viktor closed his eyes for exactly 2 seconds. When he opened them again, he looked like a man who was recalculating every single decision he had made inside these walls for over a year. Every phone call, every murder discussed at his own dinner table, every offshore transfer, every rival's name spoken in anger, every weakness he had ever admitted to his brothers over vodka in this very study. All of it, every last dangerous syllable, overheard by a plus-size maid in a gray uniform, standing quietly beside the sideboard, refilling his crystal glasses. He did not ask her why she had not gone to the FBI. He did not ask her why she had not sold the information to his rivals. He asked her something else entirely. He asked her the only question that actually mattered. "Why?" he said in soft, careful English for the first time. "Did you not run?" Anya looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time in 14 months. She looked past the ice-blue eyes and the bespoke suit and the reputation that made grown men urinate themselves in his presence. She looked at the small, almost invisible tremor at the corner of his mouth, the exhaustion buried beneath the cruelty. The 9-year-old boy she suspected was still somewhere inside this 36-year-old killer, the one who had lost something enormous a very long time ago and had been punishing the world for it ever since. And Anya Petrov, the invisible maid, the daughter of a Columbia professor and a defected ballerina, the woman who had just quoted Dostoevsky at a Bratva boss and lived, gave him the only honest answer she had. "Because I had nowhere else to go, Mr. Volkov," she said quietly. "And because I learned a very long time ago from a father who is now buried in Queens under a headstone I still cannot afford to finish paying for, that the people who talk are the people who die." She paused. Her hazel eyes did not leave his. "I am not ready to die yet." Viktor Volkov, for the second time in 10 minutes, forgot to breathe. If Anya's story is hitting you the way it's hitting me writing it, the invisible woman finally being seen, the quiet strength no one bothered to notice. Drop a single word in the comments right now. Seen. Let's see how many of us know exactly what that feels like. Part 2 is coming, and I promise you, what Viktor offers her next is going to change absolutely everything. For a long, suspended moment, Viktor Volkov did not speak. He simply looked at Anya Petrov as if she were a locked door he had walked past every day for 14 months, without ever realizing there was a room behind it. Then, slowly, he rose from his enormous leather chair. He was very tall standing up, taller than Anya had realized during all those months of keeping her eyes lowered. And he moved with the quiet, controlled grace of a man who had spent his entire adult life learning how to walk into rooms without making a sound. He crossed the Persian rug toward the sideboard where her silver tray still rested. He picked up the bottle of Beluga vodka. He poured 2 fresh glasses, 3 fingers each, exactly the way tradition demanded, and he held one of them out to her. "Sit down, Anya Mikhailovna," he said quietly, using the formal Russian patronymic that meant he had just, in a single breath, acknowledged her father by name. "We have a great deal to discuss." Anya took the crystal glass with fingers that had almost stopped trembling. She sat in the leather chair Dmitri had occupied 10 minutes earlier, the leather still faintly warm, and she felt the impossible weight of the past 14 months slowly begin to shift inside her chest. Viktor sat back down across from her. He did not drink his vodka. He simply held it, watching the pale liquid catch the amber lamplight, and when he finally spoke again, his voice had shed something. The cruelty, the performance, the armor he wore in front of his lieutenants. What was left underneath was something Anya had not expected. A tired, brilliant, deeply lonely man who was about to make her the most dangerous offer of her entire life. "Your father," he said softly. "Dr. Mikhail Petrov, Columbia University. He published a translation of Pushkin's later poems in 2011. I have a first edition on the shelf behind you." Anya turned her head slowly. There, on the 3rd shelf of Viktor's private library, sat her father's book, the same slim green volume she had watched her father hold in his shaking hands the week before he died, whispering that at least he had left something behind that would outlive him. Her throat closed. She did not trust herself to speak. Viktor watched her face. He saw the grief cross it like a shadow, and he did not look away. "I read that translation the year my brother was killed," he said, so quietly she almost missed it. "I read it 3 times. Your father understood something about Russian sorrow that most translators never learn. He understood that our language does not grieve in straight lines. It grieves in circles, the way the wind grieves around old churches in winter." He paused. His ice blue eyes lifted back to hers. "I did not know his daughter was scrubbing my floors." Anya closed her eyes. A single tear escaped down her cheek before she could stop it, and she did not bother wiping it away, because for the first time in 14 months, for the first time since her father's funeral, if she was being honest, someone had spoken her father's name with reverence. Viktor did not comment on the tear. He simply waited, giving her the dignity of her grief. And when she finally opened her eyes again, he began to speak with the calm, deliberate precision of a man laying out an offer he had already decided he would not allow her to refuse. He told her about the Kuznetsov brothers. He told her about the $340 million arms deal arriving in 48 hours. He told her about the 6 translators who had failed him, about the thieves the Moscow brothers would use to hide their true intentions, about the fact that a single misunderstood phrase in that negotiation could cost him either his empire or his life. And then he told her what he was offering her in return. Every dollar of your father's medical debt at Memorial Sloan Kettering, cleared by tomorrow morning. Every dollar of your student loans, cleared by tomorrow evening. A private suite in the east wing of this house. A salary of $25,000 per week. And you will report only to me, not to Miss Delacroix, not to my lieutenants, not to anyone else who has ever made you lower your eyes inside these walls." He set his untouched vodka down on the desk. "In exchange, Anya Mikhailovna, I want your voice. I want the only translator in this country I could ever actually trust, because you have already spent 14 months proving that you know how to hold a dangerous secret without ever letting it show on your face." Anya stared at him. The number 25,000 a week did not fully land at first. Her exhausted mind kept sliding off it, unable to hold something so large after so many years of counting quarters for the laundromat. What landed instead was the quieter offer buried beneath the money. A suite, a door with a lock, a salary large enough to bury her father properly, to finish the headstone, to stop waking at 3 in the morning with her chest crushed by numbers, and a man across a desk who had just spoken her father's name like it mattered. She took a slow breath. She thought of Miss Delacroix's daily cruelty. She thought of the eviction notices she had been hiding under her mattress. She thought of her father in his hospital bed, holding her hand and whispering that she was the strongest person he had ever known, and that she must never, ever let the world convince her otherwise. And then Anya Petrov looked Viktor Volkov straight in the eyes, and she spoke in the same steady, aristocratic Russian she had used to break him 20 minutes earlier. She said, "Fine, but understand me clearly, Mr. Volkov. I am not your toy. I am not your victim. I am not another frightened woman you will grow bored of by spring. I am your voice. And if you ever call me a cow again, in any language, I will walk out of this house at sunrise, and I will take every single one of your secrets with me." Viktor Volkov smiled. It was a slow, genuine, dangerous smile, and it changed his entire face. He said softly, "Agreed." By sunrise the next morning, Anya's father's medical debt had been cleared in a single wire transfer that made the billing office at Memorial Sloan Kettering call 3 times to confirm it was not a mistake. By noon, her student loans had been paid in full. By evening, a small mountain of matte black boxes had been delivered to a private suite in the east wing of the Volkov estate, a suite with a fireplace, a writing desk older than the United States, and a bookshelf that Viktor had personally instructed the household staff to stock with first-edition Russian literature. Inside the boxes were uniforms, if they could still be called that, tailored black wool dresses, cut to honor the generous curves of her hips instead of hide them. silk collars in deep emerald and midnight blue, a charcoal cashmere coat that fit her shoulders like it had been sewn onto her body. Everything sized precisely to her actual measurements. Everything designed by a private tailor. Viktor had flown in from Milan on 12 hours' notice. And every single piece carried the same quiet message. You will never again wear a uniform that treats your body like something to be ashamed of. Miss Delacroix discovered the arrangement at 7 in the morning, when Anya walked into the main kitchen wearing one of the new black wool dresses with her chestnut hair loose around her shoulders for the first time in 14 months. The French woman's face went white, then red, then a strange mottled purple that suggested her blood pressure was about to become a genuine medical emergency. She opened her mouth to unleash something venomous. She never got the chance, because Viktor Volkov himself walked into the kitchen behind Anya, rested one large hand very lightly against the small of Anya's back, a gesture so small, so proprietary, so absolutely public that every member of the household staff in that kitchen understood it instantly, and looked at Miss Delacroix with eyes that had gone completely, terrifyingly flat. "Miss Delacroix," he said, in the softest voice any of them had ever heard him use, "Anya Mikhailovna will no longer be reporting to you. She will no longer be scrubbing floors. She will no longer be wearing anything you approve of. And if I ever hear that you have spoken to her the way I know you have spoken to her for the past 14 months, I will personally ensure that no household on either coast of this country ever employs you again. Do we understand each other?" Miss Delacroix nodded so fast her earrings rattled. She did not speak to Anya again for the rest of the week. Within 9 days, she would no longer be employed at the Volkov estate at all. But that particular story was still coming. Real quick, if you're feeling every ounce of Anya walking into that kitchen with her head up for the first time in 14 months, hit that like button one more time. This next scene is where everything shifts, and I want to make sure YouTube pushes this story to every woman who has ever been made to feel invisible. Now, let's get into the Kuznetsov negotiation. 42 hours later, the Kuznetsov brothers arrived. There were 3 of them, flown in from Moscow on a private jet, and they walked into Viktor's mahogany-paneled study smelling of expensive cigars and old violence. The eldest, Grigory, was a broad, silver-haired man with a diplomat's smile and a butcher's eyes. The middle brother, Pavel, was quieter, watchful, the strategist. And the youngest, Maxim, was 31 years old and dangerous in the particular way that men who had grown up too rich and too protected sometimes became, impulsive, arrogant, and absolutely convinced that no woman in any room could possibly matter. All 3 men stopped short when they saw Anya. She was seated at Viktor's right hand in a floor-length emerald wool dress, her chestnut hair pinned into a low twist, a leather-bound notebook resting on the polished mahogany in front of her. She did not stand when they entered. She simply inclined her head with the exact, precise formality of a woman who had been raised on stories of the pre-revolutionary aristocracy, and she greeted them in the flawless St. Petersburg Russian of Viktor's own grandmother. Grigory's diplomat's smile flickered. Pavel's eyes narrowed with instant, professional suspicion, and Maxim, the youngest, laughed openly and said something quiet to his brothers in the coded thieves' cant of the Moscow underworld, the same criminal argot that had defeated every one of Viktor's previous translators. Maxim muttered, in the specific slang used by third-generation Bratva sons who had grown up believing themselves untouchable. "Look at this. He hired a fat little house cat to translate for him. She won't understand a word we actually say. This is going to be even easier than we thought." Anya did not react. She simply lifted her pen. She wrote a single line in her notebook, and without looking up from the page, she began to translate for Viktor, in soft, unhurried English, every single word Maxim had just said, including the phrase "fat little house cat," which she delivered with the same clinical neutrality a court reporter might use to record a witness's cough. Then she added, still without looking up, "The youngest brother, Mr. Volkov, has just informed his siblings that they intend to accept your terms in this meeting, and then hijack your shipment at the Newark port next Thursday. He believes I am too stupid to understand the dialect. He is incorrect about several things." The silence that followed was the second most dangerous silence of Anya Petrov's entire life. Grigory Kuznetsov's diplomat's smile fell off his face like a piece of glass hitting marble. Pavel's hand moved, with instinctive professional slowness, toward the inside of his jacket. And Maxim, the arrogant youngest brother, went the specific gray-green color of a man who had just realized he had spoken his own death sentence into a room he did not control. Viktor Volkov, for his part, did not move at all. He simply looked across the desk at the three Moscow brothers, and he began, very softly, to smile. It was the same smile Anya had seen on his face 2 days earlier in this very study, and she was beginning to understand that this particular smile was the last thing several men in Viktor's life had ever seen. "Gentlemen," Viktor said, in slow, precise Russian, "it appears my translator has some concerns about the good faith of our arrangement. Perhaps we should renegotiate. Perhaps we should also discuss what happens to men who plan to steal from me in a language they believed no one in this room could speak." The negotiation that followed lasted 6 hours. When it was over, Viktor Volkov had extracted an additional $62 million from the Kuznetsov brothers, a permanent controlling interest in their Black Sea shipping route, and a written apology from Maxim Kuznetsov delivered on his knees in the presence of his older brothers. Anya translated every word of it without ever raising her voice above a calm, professional murmur. When the Moscow brothers finally left the estate at just past midnight, Grigory paused at the front door, looked at Anya with the strange, respectful expression of a man who had just watched a plus-size maid earn more money in 6 hours than most translators earned in a decade, and said quietly in Russian, "Mr. Volkov, do not lose her. Women like this are born once in a generation." Viktor did not answer. He simply rested his hand, very lightly, against the small of Anya's back again, and closed the door. The story of what Anya had done in that negotiation spread through the Volkov organization within 48 hours. It spread through the Bratva underworld of the entire East Coast within a week. Bodyguards who had walked past Anya for 14 months without ever meeting her eyes now stepped aside for her in hallways and lowered their heads with a specific, respectful nod that Russian men of a certain generation offered only to women they considered untouchable. Housemaids who had once whispered cruel things about her hips behind the linen closet now brought her tea in the mornings without being asked. The estate, which had run for years on Miss Delacroix's cold, brittle fear, began slowly, quietly, to run on something else instead. It began to run on Anya. And it was in the middle of that quiet transformation, on the 9th day after the Kuznetsov negotiation, that Anya finally handed Viktor the small brown leather folder she had been assembling in her private suite for over a week. Inside, it were 17 pages of anomalies. Delivery schedules that did not match invoices. Household expenses routed through accounts that should not have existed. Phone records showing that Miss Delacroix had, for nearly 2 years, been quietly selling information about Viktor's daily movements to a mid-tier lieutenant of the Orlov crime family, the oldest and most dangerous of Viktor's remaining rivals. Viktor read the folder in complete silence. When he finished, he set it down very carefully on his desk, and he looked at Anya with an expression she had not seen on his face before, something raw, something almost frightened. Something that looked very much like the face of a man who had just realized how close he had come to being killed in his own bed. "How long have you known?" he asked quietly. 6 days, Anya said. "I did not want to bring it to you until I was certain." Viktor was silent for a long moment. Then he said very softly, "You did not just find a spy inside my house, Anya Mikhailovna. You saved my life." Miss Delacroix was escorted off the property that same night with 2 suitcases and nothing else. Her professional reputation was destroyed within 72 hours through a series of quiet phone calls Viktor made personally to every high-end domestic staffing agency between Boston and Miami. She would spend the remaining years of her working life managing the linen inventory at a mid-priced hotel in New Jersey, and she would think about Anya Petrov's face every single day for the rest of her life. But the Orlov family, once they realized their spy inside the Volkov estate had been discovered, did not respond with patience. They responded with a kidnapping attempt. It happened 3 weeks later, on a cold Tuesday afternoon, in a small Russian-language bookshop on the Lower East Side that Anya had begun visiting on her rare afternoons off. 2 men in dark coats came through the front door. A third came in through the back. Anya, who had grown up listening to her father's stories about her mother's defection from the Soviet Union, stories that had always, somehow, been secretly practical lessons about how to survive men in dark coats, did not scream. She did not freeze. She simply walked calmly to the elderly Russian Orthodox priest browsing the theology section, spoke 6 quiet words to him in Church Slavonic, and allowed him to guide her out the back service entrance, into a waiting parish car, and down 2 blocks to the small stone Orthodox church where he had been serving for 41 years. She was sitting in the sanctuary drinking hot black tea with the priest's wife when Viktor Volkov kicked open the front doors of the church with 6 armed men behind him, his ice blue eyes wild for the first time in his entire adult life. He crossed the sanctuary in 6 long strides. He did not care that his men were watching. He did not care that the priest was watching. He simply pulled Anya out of the wooden pew and into his arms, buried his face in her chestnut hair, and whispered into her ear in ragged, broken Russian, "I thought I had lost you. I thought I had lost you, and I realized I would not survive it." Anya, who had spent her entire life being invisible, being overlooked, being told in 1,000 small daily ways that a body like hers was not the kind of body that men like Viktor Volkov held in the middle of Orthodox churches while whispering that they could not survive her absence, wrapped her arms around him and held on. "I am not lost, Viktor," she whispered back, in the same Russian her father had once used to read her to sleep. "I am not that easy to lose." Viktor Volkov's response to the Orlov family was surgical, patient, and absolute. Within 9 days, 3 of their shipping routes had been seized. Within 2 weeks, their Miami operations had been dismantled. Within 3 weeks, the patriarch of the Orlov family had been arrested by federal agents on charges of racketeering, human trafficking, and 11 counts of murder. Every charge supported by evidence Anya had personally translated from a decade of intercepted Russian-language phone calls Viktor's people had been quietly collecting for years, but had never been able to properly interpret. The Orlov name, which had shadowed the East Coast underworld for 3 generations, was finished by the end of the month. And in the private council of Bratva bosses that gathered in a locked room in Brighton Beach to discuss the Orlov collapse, Viktor Volkov stood at the head of the mahogany table and said, in a voice that carried to every corner of that room, "Anya Petrov is under my absolute personal protection. She is my voice. She is my eyes. She is my heart. Any move against her is a move against me, and I will burn every empire in this country to the ground before I allow another hand to touch her." 6 months later, on a snowy evening in late February, Anya Petrov stood on a private stone terrace overlooking the black, restless waters of the Atlantic. She was wearing a floor-length emerald green evening gown that had been made for her by the same tailor from Milan, a gown that clung to the generous curve of her hips and the soft, full swell of her chest with the kind of quiet confidence that only comes from finally, completely, no longer apologizing for the shape of your own body. Her chestnut hair was loose around her shoulders. Snow was falling in slow, heavy flakes onto the stone railing beside her, and the wind off the Atlantic smelled of salt and cold and the faint, distant promise of spring. Viktor Volkov stepped out of the tall glass doors behind her and rested his suit jacket over her shoulders. His hand stayed there. He turned her gently, with the careful reverence of a man handling something he had spent 36 years not knowing existed, and he looked down into her hazel eyes with an expression that no member of the Volkov Bratva would have recognized on their boss's face. "I have spent my entire life," Viktor said quietly, in the mixture of English and Russian that had become their private language over the past 6 months, speaking a language of violence. And then a woman I had dismissed as invisible for 14 months quoted Dostoevsky at me across a desk, and she taught me that the most powerful word in any language, in any country, in any lifetime, is her name. He touched her cheek with fingers that had killed men and that were now, somehow, gentle. "Anya Petrov, I do not deserve you. I have never deserved you. But I am selfish enough, and I am finally honest enough to ask you to stay." Anya looked up at him. She thought of her father. She thought of her mother. She thought of every long, exhausted year she had spent shrinking herself so the world would tolerate her presence. And she thought of the specific, quiet miracle of standing on a stone terrace in the snow beside a man who had watched her grow larger and louder and more visible with every passing month, and who had only ever looked at her like she was becoming more of what she had always been meant to be. She lifted her hand. She rested her palm flat against his chest, over the orthodox gold cross beneath his shirt, over the steady, hard beat of a heart that had spent 36 years being afraid of nothing except, finally, this. "I stopped being invisible," Anya whispered in her father's language, "the moment you finally saw me." She smiled, the slow, radiant smile of a woman who had come home to herself. Yes, I will stay." Viktor Volkov kissed her under the falling snow on a stone terrace above the Atlantic, while the Volkov Empire ran quietly and peacefully behind them for the first time in 3 generations. Not on fear, not on cruelty, not on the silent labor of invisible women, but on the loud, unshakable, hard-won presence of one plus-size maid from Queens who had refused to stay invisible one single day longer. Somewhere far away in the mansion, a young housemaid was training under Anya's kind, patient guidance. Somewhere else, a first-edition volume of Pushkin's later poems sat open on Viktor's desk, translated by a Columbia professor named Mikhail Petrov, whose daughter had, against every odd the world had stacked against her, finished paying for his headstone in full. And in the quiet snow above the sea, a Mafia boss and a maid held onto each other like 2 people who had spent their entire lives waiting to be recognized, and who had, at long last, been recognized by the only person whose gaze had ever truly mattered. All right, that's Anya and Viktor's story. If you made it all the way to the end, you already know this one hit different. Do me 3 quick favors before you go. 1. Smash that like button if you believe the quiet ones are always the strongest. 2. Drop a comment telling me, would you have answered Viktor in Russian, or would you have walked out of that study? I read every single comment. And 3. Subscribe, because next week's story is about a plus-size nurse, a Sicilian Don, and a hospital secret that changes absolutely everything. You do not want to miss it. Until then, remember, the world does not get to decide when you become visible. You do. Good night.